And I will now make a start. Can you hear me okay, Margareta? Okay, that's fine. What I'm going to be talking about today is about reduction. I'm going to say a little bit of rather familiar stuff about the three worlds before getting on to issues about their status and to Popper's ideas more generally about reduction. Everything I expect to be relatively straightforward until perhaps at the end I say some things that may be rather strange and unusual. So let's see how we go. First of all, then, some preliminary remarks about Popper's three worlds. In 1968, I was an undergraduate student at the LSE, and I was able to attend with permission Popper's departmental seminar. I would say in passing that if any of you have the opportunity to sit in on graduate seminars or departmental seminars in philosophy departments, I'd very much recommend that as a way to go, just because from seeing presentations, but especially coming across critical exchanges in these, you get a real feel for what philosophy is like that you tend not to get in undergraduate lectures. I recall Popper as giving a talk to this seminar, which was received in a less than enthusiastic manner by his colleagues. It wasn't that they were denouncing it, it was more that they just didn't know quite what to make of it. And it related to his ideas about what at that time were being called the first, second, and third worlds, which, because Popper had explained to him by some friends in due course that talking about the third world was likely to be misunderstood as having something to do with development, was subsequently described as worlds 1, world 2, and world 3. What was all this about? Well, you'll be pretty familiar with it. The key idea can be put in a mild and then in a more alarming way. The mild way is to say that we can distinguish, and may need to do so, between objects in the physical world, thoughts, and the content of thoughts. Accordingly, if I'm reading, say, a philosophical argument in a paper that someone has written, while I'll be reading something that is written on paper, my concern will be with the content of the thoughts that the person who's written it has set out, not with how this has been done physically. And clearly, the same ideas could be conveyed in very different ways. Further, we can distinguish between our different thought processes and the abstract content of the ideas, so that two people may each grasp the same ideas without our being committed to saying that in some sense, I and the other person are having the same thought processes. So much will be straightforward, and ideas of this kind are a commonplace amongst those who, for example, were concerned during the latter part of the 19th century and in the early 20th century to distinguish between logic and psychology. What in Popper is more dramatic is the idea that we can see ourselves as operating in three different worlds. World 1 is physical and is concerned with physical states and processes. World 2 is psychological and is a matter of mental states. World 3 is abstract and can be understood in terms of the contents of thoughts. There are contrasts between how we might see this, for example, as simply unfolding human culture with all its different aspects, including novels, including opera, all kinds of things, and in more logical terms, in which to assert a claim is to assert all its consequences. Clearly, if someone is a composer, and Popper has stressed this, they may actually produce something which in different ways transcends what they were intending to do. And there is quite a literature of people from very many different perspectives talking about the way in which cultural objects have a character independent of their producer. But there is a sense in which, if we're talking about stuff which is put in formal terms and where we then have logical rules of inference, we can claim that an entire open-ended set of consequences is generated. Popper described these things in quite rough and ready terms. It's clear that he thought that all kinds of refinements could be made. He didn't seem really, I think, to be particularly interested in setting these things out in detail. And he also obviously noted that they are intermingled. A physical book may serve to instantiate a World 3 object. In a similar way, two very different productions of a play might equally be said each to instantiate the play. And there's also a sense in which we can talk about mental states as sometimes grasping World 3 objects. Indeed, we can see, as is developed in phenomenology, a whole attempt to explore all kinds of features of intentional objects, of the objects of thought. Popper's concerns can perhaps be best expressed as metaphysical, in the sense that, in his view, we need at least prima facie to accept the existence not only of these worlds, but also of their interaction, if we're going to get a reasonable picture of what human life is like. Popper's view was thus that the physical world is open to our minds, and through them to World 3. I would just say in passing that in claiming that the physical world is open to our minds, he is saying something which in some respect seems to be trivial, but in another sense could seem to be really dramatic, because those people who are informed about the physical sciences tend to take the idea that the physical world is a closed system, a causally closed system, as somehow absolutely fundamental. And we'll explore some problems about this when in later lectures we talk about the mind-body problem. On his view, its openness to our minds and through them to World 3 is evidenced by the way in which dramatic changes have been made in the physical world as a result of our plans and ideas. Not only are the surroundings in which we live profoundly shaped by our theories and culture, or I mean here, the physical surroundings in which we're living, but in addition, incredible physical changes have taken place, such as took place with the use of atomic weapons in Hiroshima, which he suggests are only understandable in terms of the impact of actions informed by our World 3 theoretical knowledge upon the physical world. This, on Popper's account, leads to a picture in which there's an almost Cartesian interaction between mind and body, although in his view, we're dealing here with states, mental states, not substances, and he is not committed to the existence of a soul which, say, could survive death. But beyond this, a key role, he thinks, for our mind is to develop and interact with our theories, which in turn make their mark upon us and upon the world by way of our grasping their content, only a part of which is at any one time known psychologically to us. And through our then acting on the basis of this knowledge. So all of that is pretty straightforward in terms of what Popper's views were, but what about reduction? The status of all this might be questioned. As I've indicated, Popper was not, I think, really interested in spelling out in detail his ideas about World 3. In part, I suspect, because he was somewhat dubious about the value of attempts at philosophical ontology. In addition, however, there are indications that while he offered some arguments in this field, which he thought could pose problems for physicalism, for the view that it is only what he's talking about as World 1, which is real, his view about the status of the ideas about the three worlds was in some ways rather tentative. His views here are best set out, I think, in his paper, A Realist View of Logic, Physics and History, which was reprinted and is most easily available in his Objective Knowledge. As we've seen from our earlier discussion in lectures of Popper's The Aim of Science, he was both well aware of and appreciative of the notion that I've referred to as fact-correcting explanation, which one finds in Pierre Duhem. In that context, Popper thought that it was important for us to attempt to make scientific reductions. In a realist view, however, he sharply distinguished between scientific reductions and what he called philosophical reductions, which he took to be simply ways of talking about things which invoke few entities. Okay, so the contrast is between, for example, an attempt to show that you could actually explain so-called mental phenomena in purely physical terms, as compared, for example, to techniques of just avoiding talking about the mental. One might, for example, take Gilbert Ryle's concept of mind as being in part an attempt to argue that many things that people had taken to involve intrinsically references to intrinsically mental things could instead be redescribed in terms of ways of behaving. Popper here told a neat joke against philosophical reductionism. I should say Popper had quite a nice but not a terribly robust sense of humor. So seeing him coming up with jokes is a little unusual. This was that philosophical reductionism was, in his view, in danger of being a bit like the solution to the problem of body lice that occurred in Vienna after the First World War. Insecticides at that point were not available, and there was an infestation of body lice. The Viennese have a reputation for being rather prim and proper, and they resolved this embarrassing problem by resolutely not talking about the body lice. That, as it were, was their way of not making them go away. And here we have, I apologize for the picture, a picture of something which in post-World War I Vienna was not the kind of thing that you would talk about. Popper's view was that one should indeed attempt scientific reductions, which would be fact-correcting explanations after the fashion discussed in The Aim of Science. But that in order to do this, one needed initially to explore phenomena in all their, on the face of it, non-reductive richness. And only then, after you've done this full exploration of features of things which don't appear to be easily reduced, only then, he suggests, does it make sense to attempt such reductions. And indeed, Popper, in this lecture, uses terminology taken over from Quine, and he refers to the idea that one should start by fluffing up Plato's beard. Plato is someone who claimed a very rich ontology, Platonic world. So you fluff up Plato's beard, you make it as full as you can, you kind of cultivate it as much as you can before then attempting to apply Occam's razor to it to cut down the number of entities. But for reasons that I've indicated in an earlier lecture, I personally don't think that Occam's razor is a good way to put things, because it suggests that parsimony, having as few things in your ontology as possible, is desirable as such, while also it seems to me what one is after is testable, fact-correcting theories, which can be as complex in terms of entities as one might wish for, provided that if you're introducing these things, you explain how tests can be undertaken or how your theories about them can be critically appraised. Indeed, Popper is actually critical of philosophical reduction just on the grounds that it may serve to obscure what we actually need to do if we're going to accomplish a proper scientific reduction. He's worried that it may obscure what we need to do when trying to offer a scientific reduction. But what is his view of reduction as such? His ideas here are interestingly set out in quite a late paper of his, one that he wrote while I was working as his assistant, called Scientific Reduction and the Essential Incompleteness of All Science. It's now been republished as part of his postscript. It didn't initially form part of the postscript. It was written instead for, I think, a conference on the philosophy of biology, certainly to go into a collection on the philosophy of biology. In this paper, Popper again argued that attempting scientific reductions was an extremely fruitful method for science to follow. But at the same time, he argued, and with many detailed examples, that it's seldom the case that such attempted reductions, even when we can learn a whole lot from them, have actually been completely successful. What does all this amount to? I'd have thought that one gets to the following position. First, Popper thinks that we can't know for sure whether or not an attempted reduction will be successful, and that if it is, this would actually be a major triumph, a major advance in our knowledge. At the same time, he thinks that reductionists typically don't distinguish between the value of reductionism as a methodological approach, as something which it'll be fruitful to try to accomplish, and the idea that reductionism is in fact correct, that there are only a very limited number of entities in the world, or perhaps that all there is just physical. Here, Popper, while open to the possibility of reduction, has stressed in concrete terms that, in fact, many attempts at scientific reduction have been less successful than reductionists seem to think. Back to the three worlds. How does this relate to the three worlds? Well, here I take Popper's view to be the following. First, I don't know him to have repudiated the ideas that I was talking about earlier from a realist view of logic, physics, and history, which means that in principle, he must be open to the possibility of reduction. And indeed, to think that attempted reductions are an interesting way to go. But at the same time, and he offers this argument in The Self and Its Brain, just because the possibility of a fact-correcting explanation, say of World 3 phenomena, can't be ruled out, does not in itself show that it's actually likely to occur. That's to say, he doesn't repudiate the attempts, but he says it's one thing to say, I'm going to try to do this. It's quite another actually to succeed. And he also, in commenting on an argument that was advanced by John Watkins, notes that it's difficult for us to understand what a fact-correcting explanation of statements about consciousness could amount to. That's to say, if you want to do a fact-correcting explanation about conscious phenomena, somehow you need to give us an alternative theoretical explanation of these things that doesn't refer to consciousness. But what quite could that amount to, given that somehow one would seem to have to be trying to simulate our subjective experiences in terms which do not themselves involve conscious experience? He doesn't want to rule it out. Because, for example, someone might say, well, consider the reports that there were of witchcraft or of demonic possession, or the reports that there have been of spirit mediums being able to have discourse with and to be channels for beings from a spirit world in some way beyond ours. Now, it's not impossible for someone to think, well, there were these various phenomena. They were understood in theoretical terms as involving magic, witchcraft, spiritualism, and so on. But actually, we may want to try to offer alternative explanations of these things, which don't invoke magic and so on, which rather offer alternative and better descriptions of what was going on, which managed to explain these things without having to refer to those other theoretical categories. And so there are people, and I think Paul Feyerabend in some of his work in this area was one such person, who put forward the programmatic idea that we could try to explain the phenomena of human consciousness in a similar fact-correcting way. And what Watkins was saying here, and Popper, I think, didn't disagree with him, is, well, okay, I mean, you can say that, but it's not clear how this is going to be done. I mean, what on earth could simulate these things? But this is just to raise a question, because I suspect that people who were heavily into spiritualism, or in earlier centuries heavily into things about witchcraft, would say, well, I don't see how possibly you could explain these phenomena without referring to spirits or without referring to supernatural things. And so clearly, until the theories have been put forward, you can't imagine how it might be done. I would take Popper's point to say, well, just saying that you can't rule it out doesn't mean that you have an acceptable such explanation available. More generally, it would seem to me that Popper's view is that it is open to us to engage in philosophical argument about the mind-body problem, for which we might hope to learn. And in this context, indeed, for example, in the papers of his in Conjectures and Refutations, And then in the self and its brain, he raises a number of problems that he thinks face non-interactionist views about the relationship between the mind and the body. At the same time, the proponents of the views that he's criticizing would say, well, for us, there seem to be immense problems about understanding how, in principle, things that aren't physical could have causal effects on things that are. Philosophical arguments we can learn from. I think we should take them seriously, but they're not definitive in the sense that if you look at the history of philosophy, there have been striking arguments which over time we've come to understand don't work in the form in which they were initially put forward. They might work in modified forms, or we may come to the conclusion that some broad philosophical approaches which had looked very attractive actually turn out really to be problematic. But nonetheless, Popper seems to me to offer some interesting lines of critical argument here, which I don't think have really been given their due by people who, for example, want to repudiate interactionist views of the mind-body relation, and where it's possible to develop some of them a little further against some of Popper's critics. I'll be discussing some of these issues in my later lecture on the mind-body problem. At the same time, as I've indicated, Popper doesn't and cannot rule out the possibility of fact-correcting scientific explanations, where this may, if it's scientific explanation, may be testable rather than just being open to criticism, but where it may serve to undercut points to which philosophical argument currently appeals. So we have philosophical arguments about these things which are fruitful and from which we can learn, but also we might find that philosophical arguments in a particular area might be undercut by actually producing powerful fact-correcting scientific explanations. That being said, what seems to me a key issue raised by Popper's work is that while he is very much pro-science, he was not only interested in science and, at least to a degree, contributed to it, but he was distinctive amongst his contemporaries in taking the view that, at first sight, certainly, it looks as if the physical world isn't closed to causal influences from mental phenomena. That's to say, for Popper, if we wish to explain some things that occur in the physical world, we'll need to have recourse not just to what our physical theory says exists, but also to other ideas about what exists. These may include our ideas in, say, architecture, music, and also the content of our scientific theories. For, as I mentioned before, he wants to take the view that it's only in the light of these and our ability to act on the basis of them that, for example, we can understand such things as the transformation of the world by means of nuclear weapons, to take a very grim example. That being said, it seems to me that what one needs to do if one favors dualist interactionist views is to say a bit more about what might be the case for our ideas about these things actually to have an effect on the physical world. I mean, how is it if more is going on than just as is described in our physical theories? Well, what else is going on? And how does the do the psychological states of affairs in the human brain actually have effects on the physical parts of the brain? It's not, you can offer arguments of these sorts, but I think you mustn't duck the fact that what one also needs, although it may take a while to get it, is theories about how this might actually be taking place. I'd like now to turn to someone on whose ideas I've remarked earlier in the course, JJC Smart. I think it's worth revisiting an argument that he offered, someone who made a huge impact on philosophy in Australia, but whom I personally suspect to have been wrong about just about everything. I mean, he was a staunch utilitarian in ethics, and he was very clear on this, but it seems to me personally that he was very clear on the elaboration of a kind of view in this area, which I think is in the end horribly wrong. And I think that he's badly wrong in this stuff, to which I'm going to refer as well. Smart suggested that if we consider the claims of physicalism, the idea that basically it's physics or an improved physics which can explain everything, we need to consider, if this is being debated, whether or not we're talking about current science or some future science. His distinction seems to me to be a useful one to make, but I would have thought that it's actually, if one thinks about it, very damaging to his approach. Why? Well, if we ask, can we explain everything in terms of our current knowledge in the physical sciences, the situation is surely no, we can't do so. While if physicalism is supposed to be a claim about some science of the future, then we can surely ask, well, is this science of the future supposed to be like our current science? And if it is, we can surely say that it will then also be false if we take it to be able to explain everything. Well, if what we're wanting to discuss is some science of the future which may look very different or indeed totally different from current science, then surely we can only say, well, look, while clearly such a thing is possible, we really have little ability to discuss it, what its strengths would be and what its possible limitations will be, because we in our current situation simply have no idea what such future science would actually look like. And if you think about it, if you take physical science at the time of Sir Isaac Newton, lots of people kind of wanted to extrapolate future knowledge as looking pretty much like the account that he'd given. Well, future science has developed. We're now able to see just how wonderful and impressive Newton's ideas were, but at the same time, we're equally able to say that our current picture of the world really doesn't look much like the picture of things that Newton was offering, and what in principle we might hope to explain using it might, on the face of it, seem to look rather different from what things looked like at the time when Newton was writing or when Newtonians were writing. So the problem, I think, about thinking about the content of the future science and debating what it could and what it couldn't explain is that we just really don't know what we'd be talking about, at the very least. Such a future science would need both to be able to explain and to improve on what we can explain in terms of our current scientific knowledge, and if it's supposed to explain things we can't currently explain, to extend theories that are being used to do that, also to explain what we currently take to be mental experience and cognitive and cultural material. And I think we've got no real idea what could actually do that. It's in this context that it seems to me useful to think back to Popper's argument about fluffing up Plato's beard before attempting reductions. For what is striking about Smart's approach is that he seems to me to take almost the opposite view. That's to say, He recognizes that current science doesn't explain everything, but he seems to me to assume, without, as far as I can see, offering us good reasons for this, that future science will be pretty much the same as the sort of stuff that we've got, while at the same time tending to diminish and to poo-poo the importance of those things which we can't currently explain. The fifth part of my talk, conclusion and some wider problems. More generally, it seems to me most plausible to think of animal and human consciousness as something that's emerged with life on Earth, or wherever else life has emerged, and which, along with its products, plays a functional role. That's to say, and we'll talk a bit more about this when we talk about Popper on biology and evolutionary theory, where it seems plausible to suggest that human consciousness isn't just there, as it were, but that it actually has played an important role in our development. And not to be the kind of thing that one would expect to be able to explain in terms of properties that relate to matter in general. That's to say, it would seem to me to be rather odd. I mean, it might happen, but if one could come up with theories that explain the whole development of physical material in the universe, which are also at the same time adequate to explain what seem to be these very strange phenomena connected with life and with human consciousness and with the development of culture and cultural products. However, if we take such a view, a broadly Popperian view, it leads on to what I take to be some wider problems. The first of these is really that if the sort of three-world picture that Popper is offering is correct, then it gets us into wider problems about metaphysics and science. Popper's offering a picture in which there exists a physical world, the character of which is, we hope, gradually to be disclosed by work in the sciences. And this, on his account, was, as far as we know, all that there was originally, so that on Popper's account, you start with the physical world, with World One. Clearly, on this point, his views would differ from those of some religious people who take the view that while Popper's three-world interactionism is fair enough, and I would say that if you read some religious writers on scientific topics, they will take a view that in some ways is rather similar to Popper's and say that physicalism is an inadequate view to take, sometimes referring to just the same kinds of things that Popper does. But for them, there was also all along, also God, the spiritual realm, and also a realm which they tie up with God of absolute values. So their metaphysics, while they're in agreement with Popper about the inadequacy of physicalism, their metaphysics is very different, because while Popper seems to me to be one of the emergence of these things with life, for them, they are fundamental features of the universe from the world go. Popper's view would, as I've indicated, seem to me to contrast with this. Just because if his picture is correct, we're faced with the emergence of life and the emergence of his second and third worlds. This opens up in turn a realm of issues. First, what is to be made of emergence? And if things emerge from the physical, which aren't themselves physical, and there is interaction between them, you'd seem then to need to be able to give us an account of causation from those things onto the physical world. And there is quite a literature now back and forth about ideas concerning emergence, interaction, and downwards causation, which it seems to me, if people are interested in Popper's approach, they should have a look at and see how the argument is gone, To what extent can they are they wanting to work along the same lines as the people who are non-Popperians who've talked about these things, but what also about the criticism of these ideas? There are literatures and thus lots of things to be investigated to see if one could make good sense of such ideas. Second, what would the physical universe have to be like for emergence to be a possibility? That's to say, in what sort of terms would the purely physical have to be understandable such that these future non-physical developments, which nonetheless then subsequently affect the physical, are themselves possible? All this is highly speculative. It gets us into very interesting and difficult issues. It opens up possibilities for further investigation, both in metaphysics, in philosophy, but also for interesting speculative scientific ideas. But we would seem here, to me, obviously not to be dealing with issues which we could expect to resolve analytically, other than analytical discussion, for example, showing us why one particular approach, which perhaps we thought attractive, is more problematic than we had expected. So critical analysis in terms of debunking our ideas can really be very important. It seems to me rather that we are clearly, with this stuff and also with other competing approaches, dealing with things which themselves fall into the category of metaphysical research programs, of systematic attempts to address broad problems about the character of the world, which stand in need of elaboration over time, and then of critical discussion, and of ongoing comparison with alternatives. It is this which, in my view, gives critical rationalism its rather distinctive character, and one which contrasts with that of other approaches in contemporary philosophy. That is to say, if one gives up, as I think we should, the idea that we can justify our claims to knowledge about these things, then we would seem to me to be in a situation in which the best we can do is to offer, in response to problems which face us, imaginative suggestions as to how they might be resolved, which are ideally open to testing, or if not, open to criticism. We'll obviously find that our ideas may hit empirical problems. Critics may also be able to show that there are problems about the philosophical ideas which we've advanced so far. But above all, we'll surely admit that we face open problems at every turn, issues which we need to resolve to make such an approach coherent, as I've been discussing today, coherent, but which we don't yet know how to deal with. It is this that, in my view, shows the intellectual adventure open to us if we're interested in critical rationalism as a research program. We will always wish to interact with others to discover new and interesting problems about our views. It's typically only from talking to other people who see things differently that we can discover that things that we had thought to be all right are actually problematic. But also, we can then compare how we're doing in relation to how much progress or otherwise is being made by other approaches. And it seems to me that all of this offers about the most interesting picture of intellectual life and endeavors to develop the growth of knowledge that one could ever imagine. Let me call a halt here and let's turn over to discussion. Please stick your hand up if you want to raise problems or difficulties. Anything, or you just completely lost? Margareta, I didn't think you'd be lost for words, surely.
Actually, I just wanted to share that I was in strategic management doing a PhD. And so when I read about the three worldviews, it made 100% sense to me. Now, the interesting thing is, I have to say retroactively, it didn't happen like instantaneously. It took me several years. Actually, now I seem to have contradicted myself, but as in management, we have people with an idea and it's all in their head. And then they write it down on a napkin, and then 10 years later, they're a millionaire because they. So for me, it was an interaction between World 2 and World 3, bounded by World 1. And so this, I still have a lot of hope for World 3. I think we just need to be thinking carefully about how it is being expressed. So, and then I have also a question, but maybe I first let other people.
Okay, that's fine. Does anyone else want to come in? Questions? Criticism? Nothing?
Well, I just want to add that there are many people who didn't like this theory of three worlds. Like Hans Albert didn't like it. The other guy from Argentina, what's his name again? Who wrote this? Who made this collection of works from Popper? Mario Bunge. He didn't like it either. There are several people who don't like this theory of three worlds. I liked it from the moment I read first of it about it in the book of the booklet of Brian McGee, and I think he explains it very good. I liked it from the moment I read it, but many people don't like it. I don't know. And you have an explanation for this?
Well, sorry, you asking?
You tell me.
Yeah. I mean, my explanation I gave in part last time, which was a lot of the content of it, Popper had come up with prior to introducing the three-world distinction. So it wasn't clear, for example, at the seminar that I attended, I think people are saying, well, is this just an addition to terminology? I mean, what is new in this? And then the other element of it is that Popper does want to argue that the physical world is genuinely open to causal influences from things that aren't physical. And this typically is seen as highly problematic by many philosophers. And the third element really relates to two things about World 3. On the one side, and I mentioned this in earlier lectures, there is the question of what he's really talking about. Because on the one side, you might have ideas about World 3, where you have a theory that's laid out, it's formulated, and from this you can draw logical consequences. With this can be contrasted, talking about aspects of human culture. For example, once a particular kind of innovation is made in a particular musical form, this opens up various kinds of consequences. It, in a sense, opens up new worlds. It also poses problems for how things were being done before, but the relationship between these things seems in some ways analogical, because when you're dealing with the cultural phenomenon, you're not talking about logical consequences, or not in the first instance about logical consequences. Another kind of issue is what sort of existence is being claimed for world 3. That's to say, if someone has an idea and puts it forward, in what sense is it being claimed that the undiscovered content of that exists? Are you saying simply, well, in some sense or other, there is the potentiality for people to discover new consequences of these things? Is that discovery to be understood in terms of a discovery relative to the particular forms of logical inference that they're admitting, so that if, depending on what they admit, world 3 would have different contents? What's really going on? And so I think in these respects, there was a kind of raft of misgivings about what Popper was saying, and where particularly the last thing that seemed to interest him was the possibility of writing in detail something which would try to set out to clear up all of these and other possible difficulties and ambiguities. So I think that that's why there was a certain dissatisfaction.
May I ask a question, Jeremy?
You bet.
Yeah, you had said that you attended a lecture in 1968. Is that the autumn of 1968? I wonder, because that would tie in with the first airing of what became the theory of the objective mind, which is now chapter 4 of objective knowledge. And another version of that also exists in Search of a Better World as the 12th chapter of that book, as an objective theory of historical understanding, both of which appear to have first been aired or first been presented in September of 1968. So you may well have been there at the very moment where... No, no, you were not. Okay.
No. This was an informal talk that Popper gave to his Tuesday afternoon seminar at the LSE, which in a sense talked about ideas which were to be found in the papers which subsequently formed chapters 3 and 4 of objective knowledge. But each of those had material on different specialized things that he didn't talk about. He was talking just more generally about the 3 worlds. But it was just an informal talk to his seminar. It wasn't a public lecture.
Right, so 3 and 4 is epistemology without a knowing subject, and then on the theory of objective mind. So these were kind of precursors that he later built into.
He had given, I think, I can't remember the details of the presentation of this, but the situation is roughly this. If one looks, for example, at his Of Clouds and Clocks in Objective Knowledge, there is a whole lot of stuff which, when I was doing the index for objective knowledge, when I was doing an index for the notion of world 3, I also put in references to a whole lot of things in that paper, but he hadn't in that paper got that terminology. The lecture was one where he was really introducing to his department that terminology. He may well have given papers elsewhere talking about that, but this, as far as I know, was the first time that he presented just on that to his seminar. And I mentioned it purely because there was something of a stunned silence when he did this, because people just didn't know quite what to make of it.
Well, okay, thank you for explaining
Margareta?
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Right now, okay, a positive question. Popper may not talk about the 3 worlds, but he has kept on talking about the distinction between the third and the fourth function of language, the descriptive function and the argumentative function. And I was wondering whether you have made a connection in your own thinking that the two actually are closely connected.
Yes, yes, yes.
And so then in that reading, he was still working on it, but he just wanted to give it a secure foundation in evolutionary biology. Yeah.
Well, it's less, no, I mean, the problem is the material to which you were referring certainly goes back in his papers written in English to a couple of things which were published during the 1950s.
Yes.
And you then have the Of Clouds and Clocks, which was published, I can't remember quite what date in the
1965.
Yeah,
there was the Compton lecture in
1965. Yeah, but that was in 65, but it's just that the three world stuff, as I tried to suggest last time, picks up a lot of themes which have been around in his work prior to that, and then offers this this three worlds terminology. And what I was trying to suggest was, in the beginning of this lecture, that a lot of his colleagues, I think, just didn't really see quite what the point of the terminology was effectively, because they could say, well, you've been saying a lot of rather similar things before. What does talking about three worlds add? Okay.
I'll let Hassan ask his question before
Fine.
I ask my next one.
Hassan.
Yeah, I want to change the topic. I want to, yeah. Regarding reductionism, Jeremy, you said that Popper was not in agreement with reduction as an ontological or metaphysical or philosophical approach, for sure. And but he thought that reduction might be a good thing in as a methodological approach. And my question is, can we say it's not enough to say that it might be a methodological approach? We should say that it's necessary, because when we have different factors, even in simple experiments and in simple theory development in science, we should disregard many factors and just focus on two factors and then change one of them and then measure the other one. So reduction is one thing that is everywhere in scientific practice. And even sometimes we have some assumptions that we know that they're false. For example, we just consider 1 point for the mass of something bigger, just a point mass, or frictionless surfaces, and so on. The things that we assume even when we know that they are not so. So we make these sort of reductions and these sort of assumptions just to figure out how to deal with some limited factors. So I think reduction is something necessary for our methodology.
Can I come back at you? Because
yes, please.
I think, first of all, when Popper's talking about reduction, he is concerned with such things as, for example, does one actually need to admit that there are, for example, distinctions between what is living and what isn't living, between what is organic and what is inorganic? Does one really need chemistry? Or is chemistry just a kind of kindergarten way of doing physics? And also you can, and this is why I talked a bit about the three worlds, you can also ask, is it the case that there are things which are not physical, which both exist and which also interact with what is physical. And in the face of this, Popper, on my view, wanted to say there is a distinction between simply trying to avoid invoking entities or strange things on the one side, and on the other, actually getting a scientific reduction which really shows that you don't need to invoke these other things, and which will, in a sense, or at least in principle, correct how we were earlier envisaging things to be. Now, there is the big contrast then is this. For Popper, the key achievement would be attempted scientific reductions. And he thinks that the endeavor to accomplish these is likely to be fruitful, even if in the end you don't manage the reduction. But his view is that is a very different thing from just simply downplaying the significance of these things. And what Popper wants is that we should really explore the things which are challenging in as richer terms as we can, so as to get a real feel for what the scientific and philosophical task is before us if we're wanting to try to eliminate these things. And so what you were then talking about making oversimplifying assumptions and things of that kind is really a very different matter from this issue, and where it seems to me certainly that Popper's ideas about this are really quite striking and interesting, and where, I mean, I'd also be tempted to say that they are in some ways challenging, because I think typically we live our lives as if explanations for things on the human level, as if responsibility, as if a whole lot of things connected with the phenomena of human life are actually real and really matter, as if morality is in many respects an objective matter, but where typically we tend to be attached to metaphysical theories, which actually say this isn't true at all. And so the challenge, I think, that I would take Popper to offer us is first to explore these features of human life that we're taking for granted as richly as we can, and in as coherent a way as we can, and then see if there are alternative ways in which these things could be explained, but doing it rigorously rather than just by hand waving. And so on my reading, he's offering us a view that contrasts with our regular one. And it was with an eye to this that I was in an earlier lecture talking about the selfish gene stuff, which certainly, if the aspect of it that I was referring to is right, offers an interesting and challenging and rather unsettling picture of how we should understand morality, but at the same time, one which, if we even think, well, let's suppose that might be true, what then does that mean for our day-to-day lives, for our conceptions of responsibility towards other people and so on? and where I guess one element that I get out of this stuff is that we typically don't, in a certain sense, take a lot of our ideas seriously enough and really consider the degree to which we may well be believing things and conducting our lives on the basis of things that are actually a whole lot more problematic than we take them to be.
So just let me have a follow-up on this. So if my point was that when we move from for example, thinking about physics as a type of scientific worldview towards physical theories, then always theories are such that we disregard some factors and focus on some other factors. And when we want to have even that first phase, when you want to fluff up Plato's beard, when we want to describe things in the richest way possible before we start using the Occam's razor, even in that case, we want to describe the world using our theories, and our theories are always reductionist, because in each theory we should have some factors after we disregard some other factors. So always we are in this process.
No, because what I was trying to say was that there is there's a difference between missing some things out of a description or effectively claiming that while certain factors are still there, they're not of sufficient significance for what we're trying to explain to be worth bothering about, as distinct from saying there are a whole bunch of things which we take to be there and to be of key importance, which in our scientific endeavors we may try to show aren't important. So, I mean, there have been cases, I referred to this issue about the supposed distinction between organic and inorganic chemicals, and where, on my understanding, this was something which was thought to be a real distinction in the world and to be of very great significance. And then as a result of scientific work, it was then argued, no, actually, there isn't any difference. They're simply sort of what you're dealing with here, say in the organic, are typically things which are larger and rather messier and may have slightly different bonding arrangements and so on. But this category of a fundamental distinction here isn't needed. And it's that kind of thing, rather than saying, let us here disregard friction, for example, that I was concerned with in the talk.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, no worries. Anyone else? Margaret.
Yes. I was going to ask your perspective on a proposal. What I see in the three worldview is, and including the arguments about reduction, is actually four different arguments that are mixed together and I need to be separated, and that was perhaps Popper's challenge to separate them. So the first one is that they say we need to discuss our ideas in world three form. So that he says we need to write them down. And so he doesn't deny the value of argumentation like we do now, but that he really says if you want to make progress in science, and if you look at the history of science, it's when people actually wrote things down and then they discussed whatever was written down, that there was progress. So that's one thing that he say, write it down, don't talk about what's going on in my head, look at what I've written down. But then there is number two, that he say in our models of what we write down, we need to make distinctions, logical distinctions, and we cannot be casual. We need to propose distinctions, and then we need to criticize our distinctions, but we cannot just go back and forward and switch from one set of distinctions to another. So that's the logical part. But then that there is also a real part, and that he says the human mind is interactive, it's discursive, I like to call it. It is continuously interacting with its environment, and that is what makes the human mind, or that is a special attribute of the human mind that we need to really acknowledge and take seriously. And I call that the discursive mind. And I was going to ask as a separate question, sorry, I'll leave it for now. And then there is number 4, that I think is also important, is that Karl Bühler was his dissertation advisor, and he worked with this concept of the gestalts and gestalt emergence and gestalt shifting. And so does that Popper had actually some ideas about the human mind and the importance of the development of the human mind of a baby that has a very plastic brain, and the baby interacts with the environment and becomes an adult, and there are these gestalts that emerge in the human mind, but that since Popper had decided he was going to focus on logic, he didn't, I mean, actually he wrote a couple of papers on students and how they learn. So he did pay attention to the human mind, but that he had decided he was not going to talk about it, but nevertheless that is in the back of his thinking, dus that our brain is very plastic in response to interactions with the environment, but for whatever reason he was only going to talk about logic.
Okay, can I comment
Yes.
on this?
Yeah.
On the first point, yes, the importance of explicating things and objectivizing them, really very important. In terms of distinctions, well, do bear in mind Popper's stress on our doing this only ad hoc and when it's needed, and him really being an opponent of those people who want to say we have to sort of spend a lot of time on making systematic distinctions unless there's an explicit need for it. The interactive material, yes, but the challenge then is, how do we give an account of the character of the mind and how it interacts with things that are purely physical? And where I've indicated there, and I'll talk about this in a later lecture, one of the issues that comes up is just what sense can be made of different things of different characters interacting with one another, and also does it actually look remotely plausible that that is what's going on? But so that at one level there, you can say, well, these things are interesting and attractive, but at another level of it, you've got other people who say, well, look, if you consider the details of what's involved, either effectively as metaphysics, or if it's compared with what's going on in science, then it may be problematic. And Bühler, I don't think that Gestalt psychology has any influence on Popper at all. I think that he's closer to the Würzburg school and to taking a biological view of psychological phenomena. You have from time to time talked about Gestalt psychology and Gestalten. I don't see Popper as being in the least sympathetic to that.
Yes, so may I respond now?
Yes.
Let's start with the Gestalt psychology. There are actually different schools of thought in the Gestalt psychology. So I'm not at all implying that he is following the what is it, the Wertmüller, Kohler, and I forget the third one. Is the Catal psychologist who came to the United States. He is taking it in a very different way from them. But it's still, it's actually the switching of the gestalts, because for the three worldview to work, we need to switch gestalts while we're looking at our environment. So there is more to be said there.
Yes, but I think not now. I mean,
Yeah.
we can go
Yeah.
back to that.
Yeah.
But what I would say is, if you're making, I mean, Popper has said, I mean, he goes on a great length about Bühler and the theory of language.
Yeah.
He has said that there are commonalities between his approach and that of some of the Würzburg school people. There's also been this book that's been written claiming that he's very close to Seltz. I know
Yeah.
of this, but where I think what one would have to do if you're going to try and make anything of this is to look at what we have in the, at the moment, only in German, in the frühe Schriften of the remnants of Popper's earlier writings on this, and then make the argument on that basis. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, there were two more things I want to also get back. When you talk about logic, I actually, the logical distinctions, I just read the two fundamental problems of knowledge again. And there is a distinction between universal logical statements and particular logical statements. So Popper's ad hoc method is that all of us need to use logic in a particularist moment, that we shouldn't go and try to develop a universally true logic. So I'm in total agreement with you. I think Popper is saying here, even as a particularist, we need to not switch around distinctions all the time. We need to be a little consistent in how we make distinctions. That was what I was trying to say.
Okay, but it was that, I mean, there are two twists there. First of all, in Die beiden Grundprobleme, at the time that he was writing that, modern logic was still very much in the course of development. And so I think, I mean, it's striking that Popper, when he gets to New Zealand, is following work then in logic that Carnap is doing, and is getting sort of quite excited about that. So I think one has to be a little careful of Die beiden Grundprobleme, just because some of the stuff that he is talking about there may not be very easy to relate to or to translate into the later developments. And I would stress again, in terms of distinctions, the key thing there to bear in mind is what he says about its use of meaning. I mean, namely, do it on an ad hoc basis.
I'm in 100% agreement about that, but there's still a systematicity, and that
you keep talking about systematicity, and I keep saying I'm not so sure, but this battle we'll have to fight. I've got Philip, who's been wanting to come in, and then maybe we can come back to further points, Margareta. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just that Margareta had made reference to Gestalt, and I think Popper does not use a theory of the mind form of Gestalt. He is interested as early as the Poverty of Historicism in a Gestalt model of holistic understanding. So while he rejects holism in the Hegelian sense, he recognizes that there is a sense in which groups impose a certain character on those who are members of that group, or traditions influence the conduct and the character, if you will, of its members. In his later work, I think you mentioned the 1965 lecture, the Compton lecture on clouds and clocks. There is this very important reference to plastic control, where we establish certain regulatory aims, norms, and aspirations, if you will, that regulate our conduct, that is almost Gestalt-like in the sense that he had used it in Poverty of Historicism. And of course, there are ideas of downward causation that he imports from, I think, Donald Campbell to a very substantial extent, where you see our broader commitment to objective world, to world three commitments, if you will, that then influence how we see the world and how we act in the world in that respect. So I was just going to add that. I think the Poverty of Historicism does have some minor references to Gestalt in that limited sense, and as I say, I think it's displaced by concepts of plastic control and downward causation, which he merges into his conception of world three, I think.
I would say on the plastic control stuff, I've got a lecture coming soon about stuff on biology, which will be talking specifically about that. Can I just get?
Well, I think it's not just biology. Sorry to interrupt. I think it is actually very much a social commitment and social norms and it is that structure of human self-organization and non-deterministic or non-rigid deterministic.
Yes. I don't disagree. All I'm trying to say is you've got a lecture. I mean, for any of you who puts up with it, you've got a lecture about that stuff coming. So if we can take the discussion of that then. Can I just get an indication, is there anyone else who is wanting to get in with questions or objections? Okay, well, I suspect Margareta may have, yes, I said anyone else on the grounds that I suspected that Margareta would have one or two things more to say. And I just wanted to say to see if there's anyone else who's queuing, but if not, let's come to you.
Hi, I wanted to ask about Mark Noturnal's book on, I think he, objectivity, rationality and the third realm, in which he compares it with Frege's third realm, but Noturnal also takes kind of the logical approach that I call dialysis, and that we both call dialysis, or the ad hoc logical approach. And I just that you make distinctions and then you see how far you can go with the distinctions. And I was just curious what your view was, whether you have read the book or whether you have an opinion on it. Yeah.
I'm not a fan of Marx, I'm afraid. So it's not something on which I can comment.
You didn't read the book?
No, I am not someone who values very much his work on Popper, and I don't really want to talk about it.
Okay. So then I had another question, if that's all right. When I was thinking about the discursive mind, partially because of also the work of Michael ter Hark, this about the Otto-Sells connection. Yes. Then, of course, the name of Rom Haré eventually crossed my horizon, because he also uses the word discursive. And whether you have any views on whether there was ever a connection between the two, whether they ever talked, or whether they were two separate streams of work.
Okay, Harry, I gave some courses of lectures at a summer school in Sweden, and Rom Haré was also lecturing there. And I've read some of his things, and I got to talk to him there. My impression is this: Haré is someone who has got lots of different ideas. He developed some ideas from the later Wittgenstein, which he saw as being akin to some of the work of Vygotsky. when he talked about this, I thought there is a lot in common here with aspects of Popper's work. It's also the case, I think, that the ideas which Haré had come very about the philosophy of science seem to me to come in some ways rather close to what my understanding is of many aspects of Popper's work. Haré, I think, had a very different view of Popper and didn't really see there as being commonalities between them. But I gave, as one of the lectures, I gave a kind of broad brushstroke, very much Popperian picture of epistemology, and Haré didn't seem to disagree with this at all. Haré, with regard to Popper's metaphysical ideas for the development of science, I think that Haré had views which were in some ways similar to these, but it's worth noting that Popper, because the postscript was published so late, and because things came out only in dribs and drabs, a lot of things which play a significant role in Popper were not terribly well known, and where it's also the case that Popper in the Open Society is critical of essentialism, but he's critical of essentialism in terms which, as I've argued elsewhere, are in fact at odds with the kind of conjectural realism which he is actually happy to espouse with regard to the physical sciences. And I've written, well, I can't see why there's any reason why a Popperian approach can't say that unintended consequences of human actions in the social world form various sorts of structures with distinctive properties by which we may then be constrained. Now, you could quote Popper talking against essentialism against this, but I don't think he's got any good arguments against such a view. And it would seem to me to be something that makes perfectly good sense in terms of parallels with what he said about the physical world. And what one finds, for example, is that Roy Bhaskar was very influenced by Rom Haré, but also gave he effectively developed ideas in his initial work, which were a kind of combination between Rom Haré and his reading of aspects of Marx. But if one allows for some elements of Popper's anti-essentialism to be things which should be dispensed with, I'm not sure how big a gulf there is. However, Haré was indeed someone who was strongly influenced too by aspects of the later Wittgenstein. He was interested in all kinds of things. I mean, aspects of the psychology of music on which he did a lot of work, all sorts of things in social psychology on which he did a lot of work. And so there are all sorts of strands in his work in which there are, what's going on is very different from the sort of stuff that you get in Popper.
Thank you.
Anything else, or should we call it a day for now? Okay, well, if there aren't any other questions or objections, I'll thank you very much for being an audience. I would have hoped that I would have got more objections than I've got. Perhaps when I send the notes round, which will tidy a few things up and give some references, this will lead to them. And I can't remember quite what is in my, well, in fact, if you could bear with me briefly, I can probably tell you quickly what is next on the list for lectures. I'm just aware of the fact that I revise the order of some of these things. So it's just going to take me a second to.
I think biology was next.
Yes, well, I think biology indeed was the plot was that was next. And if I just look at the plan, that gives us biology, then determinism, and then the mind-body problem. And it's in the biology lecture that I was aiming to talk about the way in which, in Popper's ideas about biology, and then as developed in Of Clouds and Clocks, there are these ideas about plastic control, which also, which he's suggesting are important in terms of being a useful modification to or bringing out a feature which is often underrated in terms of Darwinian evolution, but at the same time, in the piece on Clouds and Clocks, he's also suggesting can be of importance to us for understanding the mind-body problem. So if you want something to look at, Of Clouds and Clocks, I think is really a smashing lecture of his. There are a whole lot of things in it, and it is in objective knowledge. So I will follow up on that, and I'll see you then, or at least some of you, or perhaps one of you, next week. Thanks very much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Cheerio. Bye-bye.